Hello, and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics 2021 spring semester, The Modern American City, Past, Present, and Future. I am Patrick Tuohey with the Better Cities Project, a fellow of the Dole Institute, and in this series, we are talking about issues relating to American cities. In our first session last week, we learned about the population trends that have been impacting our cities with Demographia's Wendell Cox. This week, we'll be discussing municipal finance and development. I grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I'm very glad to have with us a Tar Heel this week. Whitney Afonso is an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's School of Government. Whitney's research focuses on state and local public finance with an emphasis on local state taxes, everyone's favorite. Not a Tar Heel, but just as welcome is Dennis Strait, an architect and landscape architect with 38 years of experience. Dennis is a principal in the Kansas City studio of GOULD Evans, a nationally recognized planning and design firm. Thank you both for participating today. I am eager to learn new things. Whitney, let me start with you to give us some background. And I'm confident that the pandemic has thrown municipal finance into a tailspin. So let's talk about things leading up to February 2020, and we can discuss the impact of COVID later. First, for my benefit, can you provide an overview of cities and budgeting, and generally how similar were they in how they tax and spend?
Absolutely. And thank you, Patrick, and the Dole Institute for hosting me. It's an honor to be here at an organization that's focused on public service, just as Senator Dole was. And my best wishes go to Senator Dole and his family during this time. But when we're looking at municipal finances, there's a few things that we do have in common across the United States. And first is our reliance on property taxes. This has been our main revenue resource for quite some time, really since the start of our structure and our federalism. And what we see in common beyond that is another mix of revenue instruments and reliance on sales taxes in most states. Now, that doesn't mean all local governments and all cities are reliant on sales taxes. Some states don't even allow local governments to issue or levy sales taxes, and some don't allow cities to levy sales taxes. But they're becoming increasingly important and are the second largest stream of revenue. We also see a lot of fines and fees. In some areas, we're going to see occupancy taxes. And so there really is quite a bit of overlap, and with some interesting additions to that mix, like income taxes in states like Ohio and cities like New York.
And what about city spending? Are there trends in how they spend, or maybe what are their biggest expenses?
Absolutely. So historically, we have seen that the cost of personnel is the number one, because that's across the board, and personnel is critical to anything that our cities are doing. But looking a little beyond just personnel costs, we see that big drivers of spending are infrastructure, so our capital projects, pensions have become increasingly important, and of course, public safety. And depending on the state structure, a lot of that's also going to be schools.
And I guess I want to ask about economic development, but we can get to that in a little bit. Dennis, you've spoken in the past, recently at the Kansas City Public Library, about how we have built cities around the country we can't afford. Can you give an overview of what that talk was about?
Yeah, I'd love to. And Patrick, thank you for having me on today. The purpose of that presentation is to help our community understand that the way we've been building our cities over the last 70 years is unprecedented. And we're just now getting to a point where the infrastructure we laid down to allow us to build this way is starting to fall apart. And we're struggling across the nation to find ways to afford how to fix it, how to replace it, how to maintain it. And it's the simplest way to understand that is that you can look at how we built cities throughout our history as humans. And you can see that there was a fairly consistent evolution up until 1950. And in 1950, cities began growing dramatically in size. And the culprit is the disruptor of the automobile. Because prior to 1950, the way that we built cities was based on how close people could be to shared amenities, shared resources, each other. But after 1950, this question of proximity changed dramatically, because what happened in 1950 is that most American families at that time now owned vehicles. And once you own a car and you have the ability to get around town with a car, the question of proximity changes completely. And you can see the impact of that on the way cities have grown, the pattern of development, the resilience of development, and the ability of the new growth model to really adapt over time, like our traditional growth models did. So it's a different way of understanding our cities that is not common. Almost all of us on this call would have grown up over the last 70 years and lived in a world where suburbanization was the way that we built. But none of us really were being told that at the same time we were driving ourselves into a very deep financial hole because of the amount of infrastructure investment and commitment that we were making that was far beyond what we could afford to hold up.
So you mark the beginning of this around the 1950s, the post-war era. Is there, and I know this is probably a broad answer, but is there a set amount of lifespan for infrastructure? You know, we're coming up on 70 years. Is that about when all this repair needs to be done, or did it happen in 1985, 35 years ago, or where are we in that?
Yeah, you'll get different opinions about different types of infrastructure, whether it be our streets or our water pipes or our sewer lines, or our dams, or our highway systems, all those things. But what we've done in our presentation is to focus on streets, primarily because we can all see streets, so we're all aware of the condition of our streets. We can't see the things that are underground, so we just assume they're part of nature and they're just going to work forever. But streets, you can see how they work. You can see how they get damaged. You can see how they fall apart, and you can see the repairs that are necessary. So we focused on streets to help make these points. And you can anticipate a normal city street, to last about 50 years. And that's the measure that we use. Now, many of our streets in our city are definitely older than 50 years, and they show it. Some streets, if you take very good care of them, they can last much longer than that. But the combination of those two things, just the natural lifespan and the lack of maintenance, is what's causing the primary problem. So 50 to 70 years is getting towards the end of life cycle of not just our streets, but also our water lines and other forms of infrastructure.
When I first moved to Kansas City, I learned that there are sewers that date back to the Civil War. And I'm embarrassed to say that my first reaction was, oh, that's charming. It didn't occur to me that that is a horror from a city planning and upkeep point of view. Whitney, let me ask you, do you see 1950 also in your studies as kind of a breaking point for how cities were developing, how they were spending, how they were collecting revenue?
So it's interesting to look at this, because a lot of my research and a lot of the kind of public financial management research looks at expenditures over time and revenue mix over time. And I wouldn't say that there's one period where we really harp on this is a turning point. When we look at revenue diversification, and as I mentioned, we're moving towards sales taxes, a lot of that started to happen in the 1970s, and it's built up over time. Property taxes have been limited by tax and expenditure limits, and a lot of those came in at a similar time as well. And so that's often pointed to as a big turning point in financial management of our cities. But beyond that, for expenditures, I think the story is a similar but different one. A lot of this changes over time as our cities grow, but also as what we're looking to attract and invest in changes. So I think right now we're in a period where we're really looking at our cities to be investing in things that we had never thought they would be responsible for in the past, including affordable housing, living wage, and some equity supplements, greenways, increased public transportation in almost all of our large cities, these are fundamental shifts in the way that we view the role of our cities and the responsibility of our government. And I think those are the types of things we've seen over time. And some of that could easily go back to the 1960s, 1970s being a major period of change for our cities in terms of that revenue and expenditure policy. But it's always in flux in many ways.
So let me admit to some ignorance. So before cities took on those responsibilities, Kansas City has a boulevard system. Of course, Washington, D.C. was laid out to have a park system. New York City has an amazing park system. Were cities not managing those before? Or what changed that made those type of amenities, greenways and whatnot, into a municipal responsibility, if I'm understanding you correctly?
No, it's not that they weren't responsible for the parks that existed beforehand, but I think we're increasing a lot in our green spaces. You have planners that are going to come in and talk about some of this, but if you look at some of our zoning practices, we're seeing smaller lots and more green spaces, and that's sort of the compromise for equity and investment and how much we're going to build up and these desires for density. And so while we had parks and we had national parks in the case of DC in many respects, we're seeing a shift in how we think about it and approach it.
And I imagine that shift is costly.
Absolutely. This is especially true because I've mentioned some new revenue sources that we're leaning on, but mostly our cities are actually very constrained in what revenues they can take on and how much ability they have to change those revenues, to increase rates or change their tax base. And so we're having to innovate quite a bit and lean on non-traditional sources of revenue for all these new amenities. Because as you can imagine, just because we want more bicycle paths doesn't mean we want bad roads. Just because we want more affordable housing doesn't mean we don't care about our schools or public safety anymore. And so usually we are simply adding to the docket of things that municipalities are responsible for, but never really taking away.
Sure. Is there a break in the size of cities that is struggling with providing these new amenities or the new expectations we have? Again, maybe in the bigger, denser cities, people want this, but in smaller bedroom communities or just smaller cities, they may not be a big concern.
I think yes and no. One of it is we see regional differences. So the Midwest in particular, our largest cities there are really struggling, whereas in the Southeast, many of our big cities there are still growing and they're still seeing revenues slightly outpace expenditures, whereas in the Midwest, revenues are really lagging behind. And so some of it is size, but some of it's also regional and what that economic base was, absolutely. But yes, size does matter. And I think you talked about this some last week with the demographer, Wendell. And it's not that density is bad and it's not that we can't get economies of scale. It's just that there is a point where those economies of scale don't function like we thought. And so some of our cities have grown so much that they may not be able to provide those benefits that density has always promised us. And so some of our jurisdictions, our mid-sized cities, are still growing and they can still provide those benefits. And they don't yet face the affordable housing struggles. They don't yet face the land shortages. They don't yet face some of those challenges that our more urban areas are currently facing. In addition to that, it's the appetites of the people that live there. I think it's really interesting to see. I know our millennials are now starting to get older, but there had been a big push in a lot of our even mid-sized cities for walkability and livable downtowns. And it was because we had an appetite from residents for that, especially these younger, more urban populations. As they get older, it'll be interesting to see if they follow similar patterns of moving out to the suburbs and if that next generation will replace them. Because a lot of this comes down to mobility of our residents too. And we know some residents are much more mobile and able to choose where they're living within that metropolitan area than others.
So, Patrick,
Dennis, I have questions about what we just discussed, but how do you react to what we just talked about? Certainly you're involved in a lot of the amenities that cities are looking for.
Well, I wanted to add to some Whitney's point about the southern cities that are still growing. and not seeing the issue. Part of that's a symptom of the suburban growth model. And so you can imagine the influx of tax revenue that happens when you open up a new suburb. As long as you're opening up new suburbs, you're getting that shot of new revenue coming in. But at some point, if you're not creating enough return on that infrastructure investment, and I talk about infrastructure, I could just as easily be talking about public safety or public services, but I'll keep it on infrastructure. But if you're not generating enough value back to the community by the revenue and taxes that those new communities create, then eventually that model is going to catch up with you. Part of the reason why this is just now becoming an issue, and this partly answers your previous question, is that when the infrastructure starts falling apart, you start noticing that this growth strategy isn't working because it's not generating enough revenue to take care of itself. But while you're in the growth in the growth curve and the infrastructure is still new enough that you're not seeing the pain yet, it feels pretty good. We're getting to the end of that in most cities. Kansas City is reaching the end of that. Some cities, Detroit was the first, and it showed what happens when you outgrow your ability to maintain yourself. Many cities in our part of the world are in that cycle, but they're just not recognizing it yet.
So is it true that smaller communities, maybe more suburban, more spread out communities that are their own municipality, are struggling with this as well because they don't have the urban core to start with? Or is this just a problem of big, mature urban areas that are spreading beyond their ability to pay for it?
Well, certainly the pattern you can see in cities all around the country is that the urban center is what creates the economic engine that affords the city whatever it does. Because those are the parts of the community where the amount of tax revenues generated, whether they be land or property tax or sales tax or income tax, whatever the form may be, you'll get a much higher return in your urban areas, in your central business districts, than you will ever get out of your neighborhoods. Particularly out of your low density neighborhoods. We've always had that dynamic. That's not a new thing. That dates back probably thousands of years in terms of being the dynamic of how a city's finances might work. The problem is the proportion of urban and suburban, or of a very productive, efficiently used land and very non-productive, inefficiently used land is very out of whack. And it's a new way in the history of city building. This has been going on for 70 years out of nearly 10,000 years of building cities. So it's not like a proven method. It's something we're just now learning that has some consequences that we didn't recognize when we started building this way.
But are less dense. So, for example, you and I are in Kansas City, and there are an awful lot of much less dense bedroom communities or smaller communities around us. Are they seeing the same type of struggle of overbuilding, seeing short-term benefit and maybe not realizing the full long-term cost as is, say, a Kansas City or a Chicago or a Detroit?
I think you can say that's true. Even some of our more affluent suburbs, when we had the recession 10 years ago, they were impacted fairly immediately by the slowdown in growth, the slowdown in development, feeding that suburban growth model. And they quickly had to cut back on public services. So they were susceptible, and they realized they were susceptible to that. If you are affluent enough, if you're a community of very affluent neighborhoods, you might be generating enough revenue to balance the equation, but that's the exception. That's the top percentages of our neighborhoods throughout our cities. So if you're a community of averagely priced homes, you're going to struggle with that model because you aren't able to generate enough revenue to support your life, that way of development.
Let me remind viewers that they may submit questions to the guests at dolequestions@ku.edu. email those questions in, and we will try to get to as many as we can at the end of the talk. Dennis, Whitney talked about a lot of the new amenities, the new responsibilities that cities are taking on. She mentioned specifically bike lanes and greenways. This seems right up your alley. Is it a case, or is it the case that not only are cities struggling to provide the infrastructure we're familiar with, but they are also now trying to provide new and additional types of infrastructure?
Well, that's certainly true. And it's also true that the way we built our cities has kind of built us into a position where we have to build specialized places for bikes because our streets are so dangerous, because they're so designed just for cars that it's not really safe for a bicycle to be on it or for a pedestrian to be on it, which is, again, a relatively new phenomenon. We didn't used to build our streets so they were just conduits for vehicle travel. And engineering is starting to appreciate that and starting to recognize that, but it's, we're in the habit of building primarily to accommodate car traffic, and not in ways that make it safe to walk to school. And if you have streets that are dangerous, then you're going to have to create special streets for bicyclists. And we created a lot of these problems because we tried this new way of city building. We also, you can draw a straight line between affordable housing and this new way of city building, because we've restricted ourselves from building in our neighborhoods. If you look in your historic neighborhoods, you'll find a wide diversity of housing types. You won't just find single family homes in an entire neighborhood. That's a relatively modern way of development. In your older neighborhoods, it's very common to have a combination of single family homes of all different price points, of duplexes, fourplexes, multiplexes. Not so common to have these large apartment blocks that we see being built all over the country now, but smaller multifamily that fits into neighborhoods. Because you had all that diversity built into your neighborhoods, and because they evolved over time, not only were they diverse in type, they were diverse in age, condition. So there were a number of price points available for people to afford to be in the neighborhood that was near their job, or in the neighborhood that was near where they wanted their kids to go to school. We don't have those options available anymore because we've zoned ourselves into boxes where this income level lives here and that income level has to live over there, because we've made it a possibility to build that way. And the unintended consequences of all those attempts to make growth manageable and city building manageable and the complexity of cities manageable has made things, just created these unintended consequences that we're now trying to solve with yet additional investments and additional solutions.
Richard Florida came to fame by advocating for the creative class, talking about young professionals who wanted to come to cities, or rather that cities should cater to young professionals to bring them into their downtowns by providing some of the things Whitney talked about, walkability and bike lanes. I guess my first question is more broad. Why do cities care about density, about moving more people into their downtowns? And then the second question is, as far as we know, has that approach worked?
Well, it's certainly helping here in Kansas City. We've had, over the last 20 years, we've had a very concentrated effort on revitalizing our downtown area. And the population downtown has gone from a few thousand to nearly 30,000 living in our central business district in that zone of the city. And if you look at the value of our city, you'll see that that's our, no question, our economic engine. And it's that way because of all the things it is, not because it's the business district or the entertainment district, but it's also now a residential district, the arts district. All these things come together and make it rich and vital and able to be that productive.
And so it's worked perhaps it's worked in Kansas City. I mean, living here, I know that the cost to the general fund of a lot of these attractions is probably greater than the benefit of having an additional 20,000 people in the downtown core. But are you aware of the impact? And Whitney, I'll bring you in next. Are you aware that any of these cities have seen results, or perhaps I should ask, is there a city that's doing it right, that's attracting people downtown? Either of you.
Oh, okay. So I think there are examples of cities that have done this well. As you mentioned, I'm from North Carolina. We have a lot of growing cities in the state of North Carolina. Raleigh, Charlotte, Durham, Chapel Hill are always on that list of kind of fast growing cities. And I think some of it is that has been our strategy, is to attract these young urban workers. And a lot of that is through amenities. Like I said, I'm still very curious about whether they're going to stay. When we look at mobility of people, we know that younger people and retirees are much more mobile. And so a lot of our outreach often centers around those two populations. Affluence is coupled with that as well. And so that has some ramifications of the services that we offer and the ways that we try to attract people. But some of it is we are trying to keep some of that wealth in the city. And I think, and I know we're going to get to COVID more later, but some of the shocks that we've had to our system and how we do business and where we do business are likely to impact city strategies here as well. And I think Charlotte, for example, has done a very good job of trying to be proactive in attracting these populations and doing a good job. But at the same time, we do see growth in the suburbs around Charlotte in that MSA happening much faster than it is in the city itself. And I think that trend is not something that's going to be easy to reverse by any means, in part because we typically look at it in terms of percentages. And so when they start with smaller growth, they're able to climb those growth patterns much faster. But also, our urban cities are having to struggle. They're increasing their tax rates much faster. The cost of living there is much higher. And so it is a careful balancing act about what does it cost you to attract these new businesses, these new residents, and what are you getting for your dollars? And some of it is also creating the kind of community that you want to have. It's not all about return on investment and efficiency.
Dennis, do you have any insight? You talked about Kansas City's been working at this for 20 years. Do you have any insight as to whether or not what Whitney observed is true, which is you get young people who move into downtown, and then when they are ready to purchase a home or they have children, they move out to the suburbs, and so the city has to replace that. Again, that is anecdotal, so I don't know, but maybe this is such a new approach that nobody knows yet.
No, I think that's been measured. There have been surveys done that show that that happens. That happens in Kansas City and probably other cities. And part of it is access to schools. If you don't have good school systems in your central city, then you're going to struggle to hold on to those families who are starting to have school-age children, even though they might have moved there as early as young adults or young professionals. And as they started building their family, it was still good, but sometimes they run into that challenge. So at the same time, you need to be finding ways to improve your school systems to be able to hold those families towards the urban areas. There's also what we've seen is quite a bit of empty nesters choosing to have that urban lifestyle when they get to a point where they don't need to continue to maintain the large suburban home. Many have chosen, I don't know the proportions, but a large amount of the new residents downtown are those empty nesters that are choosing that alternative to suburban living because of all the amenity it affords.
No, I'm aware of that as well. And what about the, the costs of serving that population? So, for example, we talked a little bit about the ways that cities are collecting revenue. Kansas City has an earnings tax, which is a 1% tax on earnings. Are cities able to be successful by competing with the suburbs just on a dollar and cents calculation, rather than downtown is cool or downtown is a dense population, because what I see is in Kansas City and in big cities around the country is it is just so expensive to live within the city that you can live in the suburb, get more house, more land, and probably pay less in taxes. And so does any of this infrastructure, the additional infrastructure, the old infrastructure, allow for cities to be competitive by reducing costs? I guess part of my question is there any realistic way to fix the problems that cities are having attracting people?
Well, part of what we're encouraging is for cities to pay more attention to their development pattern and to the return they get on investment in those different patterns. Because the math clearly shows if you measure a suburban community and you measure the wealth it's generating in terms of revenue back to the city, and you compare that to the cost of service, to the cost of providing and maintaining the streets and public safety and everything else, it doesn't balance. And if you take that to a natural conclusion, you soon recognize that most of our suburban neighborhoods are in fact the ones that are subsidized. We don't think about them that way. We think that they're the affluent contributors back to the good of the city. But because it's such an expensive way to build and it's such an expensive lifestyle, and we're not really making people pay the taxes that would be necessary to maintain it, we caused ourselves to be out of whack. And we've allowed for that style of living to be one of the choices within the city without really facing the cost of that choice. So yes, it is cheaper, but it's a subsidized choice, and we just don't think about it.
No, and Whitney, please go ahead.
So absolutely. I think the way that we have structured it is it's going to be very challenging for cities to, cent for cent be less expensive than the suburbs. Just as you said, you can get more house, more land, all of that, and usually for less taxes. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but and going back to what Dennis said, a lot of that's the car. We used to see that in the cities. Part of why people flocked to them, and there's a lot of reasons, was that they had higher wages. But now that we have cars and we can live outside the city, it has opened up a lot more options for still receiving those higher wages. And as Dennis was suggesting, our cities in some respects are subsidizing their suburbs. And part of that cost isn't just the infrastructure, it's the infrastructure being used by the people who come into the cities either as workers or come in to take advantage of some of the cultural amenities or come as business travelers. And when our revenue structure is set up as being very heavily reliant on property taxes, all of those non-city residents are using city services and city amenities without paying for them in the traditional ways. This is one of the big justifications for taxes such as the sales tax or the occupancy tax. Often cities get criticized for actually importing sales tax dollars from less affluent communities. But I argue actually that the equity concerns, while still present, are not as clear as it looks because these cities are having to provide services where they're not getting traditional revenue sources. And we've seen some cities and MSAs really trying to think about this more regionally because of these issues. Last week, you talked about Atlanta some, and that a very small fraction of the people that actually work in Atlanta live in Atlanta proper. And they've had 2 failed attempts to have a transportation special purpose local option sales tax in Atlanta, where the MSA, the surrounding counties, would help finance transportation infrastructure, mostly within the city boundaries. And as I mentioned, it was failed, but this was an innovative practice trying to think about how they can finance infrastructure that more than just city residents are using and help all of those that are benefiting from that MSA contribute to the tax base.
So I presume that this vote in Atlanta was a public vote, and I'm guessing that the city supported it and the surrounding municipalities did not.
Largely, that's true. The city actually only partially supported it, though. In part, Atlanta already has very high sales taxes. So many residents were uninclined to increase their sales tax once more.
Without descending into a discussion of math, I don't want any math in this press conference. Can you give me a sense of the cost that cities are, or the proportion of city spending that is on payroll and pension compared to infrastructure?
So that really varies wildly. And really part of that is how cities budget. So cities typically actually will have at least two separate budgets. They'll have their operating budgets, and that's where all this wages and personnel costs and pensions will come in. And then they'll have a separate capital budget. Some of our smaller municipalities may not have that separate capital budget, but the capital budget's where we're going to see those infrastructure costs, and they can take out debt to finance that, where you cannot do that for your operating budget. And so they're financed very differently. In our big cities, is that infrastructure is being debt financed typically. But infrastructure and wages, and then also those sneaky pensions, which in the Great Recession caused quite a stir because we didn't realize the magnitude of how underfunded they were, make up the vast majority for most cities. And in terms of operating costs, those wages are the number one costs and benefits.
So it was suggested last week in my discussion with Wendell, and if it wasn't, it was in follow-up research that I did that was brought on by the conversation, that although, Dennis, you may argue that we're building inefficient suburbs, in fact, cities' real problem is that their cost of personnel, including pensions, is just so much higher than those smaller municipalities around them, that if you're really looking to make cities more efficient, that's where you would focus on city expenditure on payroll, which perhaps because they're mature cities, because they've got stronger special interests, are really putting a great deal of their wealth into simply maintaining their people that smaller communities don't have. Is that familiar to you, or is there anything you have to say about that?
Oh, it's not surprising, only from the fact that Kansas City is 170 years old and many of our suburbs are 60 or 50 years old, right? So if you've been practicing bad habits for twice as long, you're going to have twice as many problems. It makes sense to me. I'm going to get back to another observation on the transit issue, just to help again underscore the issue with the suburban growth that we've had. At its peak, when Kansas City will be a pre-1950, at that point in its history, Kansas City had 6,000 people per mile. And at that intensity of land use, you can serve the community better with transit. And the proof of that is towards the middle part of, in the late 1930s on up to 1940s, Kansas City had built 100 miles of streetcar line, mostly private, that was serving that development model, the model that allowed Kansas City to become 6,000 people per mile and a very vibrant city. Today, just Kansas City, Missouri has 4 times as much city, but no more population. So we've spread our people out. So we have like 1,500 people per square mile. And now we've spread all the income levels out around that. And now we're trying to connect income or workers with jobs. And we're trying to offer an affordable lifestyle where you can use public transit to get there. And it's impossible to serve because of the scale that we built the city. Is impossible to afford that amount of bus lines and bus service. So there's outcomes from spreading yourself out that really make it difficult, particularly for lower income households.
And yet Kansas City, so exactly to your point, so Kansas City did grow after the 1950s, an exorbitant amount if you look at maps. The population has remained largely flat, and yet we are adding rail transit that certainly doesn't go to the outreaches of the community that may need transit. Is it the case that we're just kind of physically growing and then spending more money and not solving any of our challenges?
Well, you put a lot into that one. We did make an investment again on a rail transit system, a streetcar system in our city, which was only a few linear miles, which compared to the 100-mile of lines that we had before is hardly anything to measure. But we put it in the most vibrant part of the city, so it's only making it better. So we are amping up the most productive part of our city through that investment. So fortunately, we didn't build a light rail line from downtown to the airport, because the cost of that and the return potential of that would have been, it never would have paid for itself. So at least we're being intelligent about that way in which we're reinvesting in our city. I'm trying to remember the other points you added into that, but
no, that's fine. I didn't mean to sandbag you, but part of the, I mean, literally, the streetcar in Kansas City has a free ridership problem, right? Like, it's being paid for by taxes along the route, but the people that are riding it aren't necessarily using it for, transit to get to work, to create economic growth. A lot of it, as I understand, is tourism, and of course, COVID changes everything. But up until the shutdown, it was largely tourism. Is the streetcar kind of a nice thing to have that makes a city look modern, or do you really think it's adding value to the few miles it exists in?
public transit is what makes cities allowed to be cities. The reason we build cities is to bring people together, to allow us to share commerce and all these other things. And if we don't have that proximity, we don't benefit through cities. We don't benefit with all this, the good it does for civilization to
Sure.
share experiences, right? So like I mentioned before, we were able to build 100 miles of streetcar in Kansas City, not because it was a public program or a major debate or a major campaign. It was just because that's how we built cities, and it grew incrementally and naturally as the city grew into itself. So I wouldn't see that the traditional ways of building healthy cities is not still the right way to build healthy cities. But we do need to find ways to address the last 70 years of bad habits so we can get back to a more sustainable fiscal model, because that is not what we have right now.
Let me encourage anybody who's watching to email your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu, and we'll get to them shortly. Dennis and Whitney, first, I want to talk a little bit about what the impact of COVID has been over the past year on cities' revenue, on their spending. And then I want to spend a few minutes just talking about, COVID related or not, what the future of cities look like before we get to questions. But Whitney, talk a little bit about COVID and what the state of our cities is.
So it's interesting. COVID-19, the pandemic hit while most cities were in the middle or towards the end even of their budget process. Most cities, their fiscal year starts July 1st. So in the spring, they're really preparing those budgets. And for our big cities, that process really starts in the fall. And so they had already done their revenue forecasts, they had already built their budgets, and suddenly they were scrambling because it was unprecedented. And honestly, the forecast was very foreboding. And with property taxes are extremely stable. And so that wasn't too much of a concern. It would require a reassessment for that to even change. So for the current fiscal year, property taxes were pretty safe. And what was adjusted sometimes was merely the collection rate. Some cities saw that as going down. But when you start looking at some of those other revenue sources, that's where it got really problematic for cities. So as I mentioned, sales taxes are huge. There's a lag typically between when the sales tax is collected and then when the state will give it back to jurisdictions, because that's how it functions in the majority of states and cities. And so they didn't even know when they were adopting these budgets what their spring numbers looked like. They only had an idea. Some of them were dependent on occupancy taxes. Utilities were being froze across the country at the state level and sometimes at the municipal level. And so they knew their utility revenue was going to plummet. And so it was a very dire picture. And we saw that reflected in our city budgets, where while property taxes were remaining stable, that's only a fraction of cities' budgets. And so many were forecasting pretty substantial losses for the first 2 quarters of the current fiscal year. And some were more optimistic after that, but there was so much uncertainty about when the economy would rebound. And so we had some very conservative budgets where we were pulling into rainy day funds, as they're often called, but savings accounts. and cutting primarily infrastructure costs and personnel costs, because those were our two big, as you mentioned, Patrick, buckets that we can pull from. And what we've seen is our sales taxes in a lot of our more rural and mid-sized cities have rebounded relatively quickly. And there's a lot of reasons for that, including higher unemployment benefits, the stimulus check, and people being able to work from atypical locations. But in our biggest cities, in our most urban areas, these have been the slowest to recover from the impacts of COVID. Business travel has gone down considerably, commuting has gone down, tourism has gone down. And when you're staying at an Airbnb at the beach, you're still getting those occupancy taxes, but people really aren't coming into hotels and eating in downtown the way that they used to. Events have been canceled. And so our urban areas are actually rebounding the slowest right now. And it's been very worrisome. I know we are in the middle of budget season right now for the next fiscal year. And with economies starting to open back up and vaccines coming out, we're seeing more optimistic pictures coming out of our urban areas, but still very cautious.
So I almost want to cheekily ask, what's the answer? What should cities be doing? For example, you talked earlier about property taxes being a much more stable way to collect taxes, but as especially more dense urban areas are looking to maybe tax the people who come in for day trips through sales taxes or whatever, they may not be getting as much of that in the short term. And again, I know this is unfair because we're still in the middle of it, but is there any indication that some cities have figured it out, or that there's a right mix? Or maybe even, do we know any cities who have just made a mess of it and we should avoid their behavior altogether?
Well, so unfortunately, the best way to handle it would have required a lot of planning in advance. So having a lot of fund balance and reserves on hand helps a lot, because you can smooth your expenditures and you can prevent yourself from having to raise taxes. And so a lot of jurisdictions, and there's so much research to support this, are really reluctant to spend down their savings. This is absolutely a time to be spending down savings. Unlike a typical recession, there probably is an end in sight, and our cities need to survive this. And as we've talked about, they're facing a lot of challenges outside of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And so this is a time absolutely to be using savings. The best case scenario for them really is to try to avoid raising taxes and making deep cuts. So we've seen a lot of hiring freezes, a lot of furloughing. Unfortunately, employees often take the brunt of this. And that's because that doesn't impact the citizen-facing services quite as much. We try to make these invisible cuts, which is why, once again, infrastructure and personnel costs get cut. But you have to be careful, because it's very expensive if you're letting people go to have to go through that rehiring and training process. There's a real cost to doing that. And so as much as you can either get federal aid or state aid and spend down savings, that really is the best case for our cities. And I think we see a lot of them doing that. But too dire of cuts is really very problematic in the long term. And increasing property taxes further is also potentially making them less competitive, because many of these cities have been steadily increasing their property taxes over time as well.
Dennis, you can imagine an organization called the Better Cities Project was horrified at the thought. A lot of people are writing off cities, the death of cities. I don't believe any of that is true, but certainly COVID has hit cities in their sweet spot, right? The density that I find attractive, and an awful lot of people find attractive, is gone from an asset to an albatross. How do you, in the mix of a pandemic like this, encourage people to stay downtown, or offer some sort of incentive that doesn't give them one more reason to flee?
Well, let me work on the density part of that first. There is no question that if you've lived in a 7-floor or higher apartment over the last year, you've had a difficult life, because your choice of going out was sharing an elevator or a very long stairwalk, with your fellow residents, and it just didn't feel safe. So anyone who could afford to find an alternative to that probably did. That is so little of the population of Kansas City that I don't know if it has much of an impact. Having the ability to walk to the grocery store or walk to the local neighborhood park or walk in lots of different places from my inner city neighborhood has been one of the reliefs of COVID. And when you talk about the kinds of densities that Kansas City used to have when it was still healthy at 6,000 people per mile, those are neighborhood level densities. Those aren't Manhattan level densities. Manhattan has 20 plus thousand people per mile. It's much more intense. And it's the word that most people think of. They think of the projects and they think of Manhattan whenever they think of density. But that's not the only way that that's not the only way to define density. There are efficient, highly livable neighborhoods all throughout our cities that aren't downtown areas. And even in Kansas City, our downtown area is just not that dense even. So I don't think we have that displacement that's been happening, the exodus that's been happening in some of our major urban centers here in the Kansas City or in other Midwestern cities. I do think it's an opportunity for cities like ours, because you can imagine now that we've all figured out that you can, in certain white collar jobs and certain tech jobs, you can work from anywhere. Our business is certainly finding that that's a doable proposition. So if you have the choice of living in a city with the affordability of Kansas City and all the amenities of Kansas City and having a high power or high paying West Coast job, that's a pretty good choice to make. And we're seeing a few people make that. And I won't be surprised to see more people choose that alternative now. The real sea change COVID's brought along is this telecommuting work from home option. We don't know how significant that's going to be, but we've certainly seen the impact it's had on traffic in our central city, on the earnings tax. Frankly, that's going to be an interesting issue to play out here in Kansas City, Missouri. But what I hope is COVID is a wake-up call, because yes, we've got some major challenges in front of us, and I hope that makes us start to pay attention that the way that we grow our cities matters. And there are ways that we can grow our cities that have good return on investment. And it's predominantly not the way we've been growing our cities. And if we focus more on those good returns, we can start to write the books and start to get a more balanced budget. And it'll take time. It's taken us 7 years to create this mess. So it's going to take a little bit of time to get back to a place where we can reach some kind of economic stability. But at least we have this opportunity to rethink the way we've been doing things. So I hope that's one of the lessons and benefits we get out of this pandemic.
Let me follow up with something we talked about last week a little bit and a little bit today too. We got another question about self-driving cars. And it seems to me, and maybe I'm overstating it, the pandemic, of course, isn't something that we could see, but self-driving cars we see. And that may just be another challenge to kind of density and urban living. If you are, again, Dennis, you make the point that people are remote working or are able to telecommute. The idea of taking a self-driving car so that you don't have to pay attention while you go into the office. Going into the office may be a thing of the past, but is there thought as to what the impact of self-driving cars to automated transit will be? It seems to me that it's an additional challenge to urban living, to creating density.
It is, but it seems to me to be science fiction still. It does show some promise. And certainly ride sharing has already disrupted certain industries and changed the demand on parking in our urban areas. And self-driving cars could have that same impact, which will only allow us to make our urban areas more livable again, because we tried to make our urban areas accommodate parking lots and wider streets and all sorts of things that are just to accommodate car traffic. And if we can reduce that, that'll only make urban living easier for all of us and safer for all of us. So I think the jury's definitely still out on the impact of autonomous cars, and that our ability to predict the future has always been quite a bit limited. So I'm not ready to go there yet and say that's going to be a big benefit or a detriment.
Dennis, let me follow up with another transportation infrastructure related question that we got from the audience. And it is, why is the US so behind in streets designed for multiple means of transportation? Now, I guess the first question would be, is the premise behind that question true? Are Europeans generally better at designing streets for walkers, for transit, for cars, for bicyclists? And if they are, why a difference between Europe and the United States?
Well, they didn't try the experiment the way we did this last 70 years of suburbanization as our growth strategy. So they never built entire parts of their cities that are geared towards vehicles. Now, they certainly had their share of sprawl, but it's just not the same order of magnitude that we have. So in more cases in the older cities and throughout Europe and just older parts of the world, cars have had to adapt to a more human-built life or form of city building. So it's not such a novelty to try and figure out how to make multimodal streets, because they were always built to be for people and then for bikes, and now cars have had to adapt to it. But it's not the other way around, where we've built streets for cars that are really wide and out of scale from a human factor and dangerous because they encourage high speeds. And there's just lots of reasons why the way that we've chosen to try and build over the last 70 years has just not been livable, hospitable for human habitat. So thank goodness we have the examples of Europe that we can go back to, because they're just good examples of the 10,000 years of trial and error that got us to the point of being able to build cities like Kansas City, Missouri, which were very vibrant at one point before we started this other way of building.
We got another question about housing and about how multi-unit high-rise apartment buildings are probably a better efficient use, but the question is, like, what are the barriers to doing that? So I'm going to suggest to that reader, that questioner, that in a few weeks we're going to be talking about housing and zoning, and we're going to be talking about what the barriers are to building more dense population. Dennis, I don't doubt you're very aware of the problem. But let me end up in the last few minutes by asking each of you, and Whitney, I'll start with you. What do you see in the next maybe 5 or 10 years? How long do you think it'll be before cities can say that they've come out of the pandemic? Again, I know this is an unfair question. And in maybe 10 or 15 years, where do you imagine the streams of revenue will be, and how will spending change, if at all?
So I think cities are really in a period where they are going to be having to rethink themselves entirely. And I think that's really premature to say. But as we are looking at businesses and industries that are now, because of the pandemic, rethinking of how they do business, realizing that those downtown spaces that are extremely costly, and the parking, as Dennis mentioned, is extremely costly, and in-person meetings and hubs for business travel, which is so much of our airport travel, is extremely costly, and they can do it effectively and productively virtually. We're going to see business shift considerably, is my expectation. And once we see that happens, business lunches, business travel, commuting in is going to change. And as we've been talking about in this hour, that's a huge part of our cities and our modern landscape. And so if that change takes place, cities are going to really have to reconsider how they choose their spaces, how they choose their amenities, and how they finance themselves, because that will be a major undertaking. And I keep bringing up mobility and how people are able to move, but we do know that certain populations, especially low-income workers, really have less ability to move. So we know that cities are going to continue having to strive to serve those populations and look for equity and how to best help those residents without maybe some of these additional resources that they've come to rely on. And I think that's going to be a huge challenge, and it's going to take a lot of time to manifest. Airports have really been struggling. We talked a lot about transportation. We didn't get a chance to talk about that. But all of this is leading to a very interesting web. And I think as we see the dust settle, our cities are going to have to respond to that and be very thoughtful about next steps.
Dennis, what do you see in 5 or 10 years? How will our cities be different, if at all?
Well, COVID's been the great accelerator in so many ways in terms of magnifying problems that were already there. My favorite discussion again about streets, we were out of a $1.7 billion budget here in Kansas City, we were ignoring a $150 million street deficit in terms of maintenance obligations that we weren't addressing. And those aren't even on the books. People don't even pay attention to that as being a cost factor, but it's a problem that pre-existed COVID, and it's a problem that's only going to continue for many more years into the future. It'll be probably at least 5 years before we start to recover from the loss of revenue due to COVID. And hopefully that's going to make us be much more careful about what we do for ourselves through our city services and where we focus our efforts and how we take care of all of our citizens. And hopefully all those important discussions that we need to have will lead to more equitable solutions that will help us be stronger, more resilient cities.
Well, let me thank both of you for your time and expertise today. Whitney Afonso from UNC Chapel Hill and Dennis Strait from GOULD Evans. And let me invite all of you watching to join us next week, Wednesday, March 10. We will be talking about race, segregation, and city development. And my guest will be Ed Pinto of the American Enterprise Institute. So on behalf of everyone at the Dole Institute and the Better Cities Project, thank you very much and take care.